My name is Abby Edgecombe. I'm the SCIP coordinator for Lincoln-Lancaster County. SCIP stands for School Community Intervention and Prevention, and we work with schools all over Nebraska to help support student mental and behavioral health. And we do that through a process of early identification, intervention, and prevention. A big piece of what we provide is education surrounding youth mental health awareness and substance use and abuse. In partnership with Talk Heart to Heart, we are putting together a 3-part series of education surrounding youth substance use for parents, educators, and any other community members that are invested in the lives of our youth. Today we're going to focus on underage drinking. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, alcohol is the #1 drug of choice amongst our teenagers, amongst our youth. It's not the #1 illicit drug of choice, and so we look at those things a little differently, but it's the most prevalently used substance of abuse. What we hear from students is that alcohol is relatively easy to obtain. Many of them will report that they get it from a friend's house, from a parent's house. Maybe they will take it from home without permission, but it's accessible to them. Several parents, other adults in their lives have alcohol around. It's in their house, and so it's just easier for them to take. Trends in teen drinking, as with any type of substance use, trends change over time, and we see that. What we're seeing right now is more binge drinking, and so more than 90% of the alcohol consumed by our young people is in the form of binge drinking, and that's really scary because we know that when a young person binge drinks, they have a greater likelihood of suffering from acute alcohol intoxication or other life-threatening consequences. Mixing alcohol with other substances has also been a trend that we're seeing because what they found, according to youth, is that it will increase the effects of one substance by mixing it with another substance. So marijuana and alcohol is a combination that we see more prevalently. Prescription drug abuse and alcohol is also another combination that we might see more of. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the prevalence of underage drinking and some of the statistics that we know are available to us. These statistics change every year depending upon the data that we get, but the most recent data tells us that by 12th grade, about 2/3 of students have tried alcohol. That does not mean that they are regular drinkers and that they're drinking every day, but we know that they have experimented with it. People from 12 to 20 years of age consume about 1/10 of all the alcohol consumed in the United States. So that's a pretty concerning statistic in my opinion, 1/10 for this age group where it's not legal for them to be drinking. So keep that in mind as we're talking about that. Alcohol is a factor in approximately 4,300 deaths per year, and that's broken down in several different categories. Car accidents being the #1, drinking and driving. Suicide is in there. Death by violence, which is not necessarily like a random death by murder or something like that. It's more likely amongst somebody that knows each other. So friends, domestic violence between a husband and a wife. Those are some of the statistics that we see in terms of death that are classified under murder. We see it's pretty significant amount of accidents, right? So accidental drownings where alcohol was involved, falling off of a balcony where maybe they were drinking and they lost their balance. But 4,300 deaths for people under 21 in the United States. And what's significant about that is those are preventable deaths. If we can help educate and raise awareness of the importance of underage drinking and abstinence from underage drinking before the age of 21. 20.1% of 10th graders and 30.3% of 12th graders report current use of alcohol. And then what we know is that early initiation of drinking is associated with the development of an alcohol disorder later in life. So we know that alcohol changes the brain in the same way that any other drug can change the brain. And that's something that we don't always think about because alcohol is legal for those who are over 21. So we might assume that it's safe, even if our young teenagers or adolescents or young adults under the age of 21 experiment with alcohol. There's still a high level of risk because their brains are still growing and developing until they're around 24, 25 years of age. And so that risk for alcohol addiction is greater when alcohol use begins during those adolescent years compared to a young person who waits to have that first drink until 21 years of age. That's significant. So 95% of the 14 million people who are alcohol dependent began drinking before the legal age of 21. 95%. That's huge. And so think of the number of individuals who could avoid having an alcohol use disorder by just simply waiting until that 21 years of age to have that first drink. This particular slide highlights some of the trend changes that we have seen in terms of binge drinking and past year alcohol use amongst our adolescents. Since the 90s, drinking rates amongst our adolescents really have had a steady decline, and a pretty significant decline when we look back in the 90s at the percentage of youth that were drinking compared to the percentage of youth that are drinking today. Still the number one substance of use amongst our adolescents, but compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago, that rate does look different. But what you can see on this graph is that rate of decline is kind of tapering off, and it's just becoming a little bit more steady. And so we can look at this graph here from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Our 8th graders are highlighted in the blue, our 10th graders are represented by the red, and our 12th graders are represented by the purple. And so you can see where we were having a decline here, and then at about 2015, that rate of use really started to taper off. Again, as with most substances, it's not surprising that we have a lower use amongst 8th graders and a higher use amongst 10th and then our 12th graders. So again, really tells us the importance of early intervention with kids. If we can catch kids during those early years before they get into 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade, we have a greater chance of hopefully putting some prevention strategies in place so that they don't go down that path. Some of the consequences of alcohol use, it's a depressant, and so as I mentioned earlier, it can interfere in normal brain development, and it can change the brain over time in the same way any other type of illicit drug can change the brain. And so we know that the teenage brain is more vulnerable to alcohol than the adult brain. And that's really important for us to understand when we're having conversations with our kids, especially if, say, mom or dad has a glass of wine sometime, but we're telling our kids, no, that's not okay for you, really helping kids understand one glass of wine on the developed adult brain looks different than on the developing adolescent brain. And that's really important for us to make those connections for kids so they understand where we're coming from with that. It affects information processing and learning and memory, both short-term and long-term memory. We know that the more a student uses alcohol, the more those areas of the brain are affected. And some of that, it's long-term it's long-term brain change that we're seeing. So it's hard to reverse some of that in a young person who has been using alcohol for several years compared to that adolescent who has experimented with it once or twice, if that makes sense. So the areas of the brain that control that decision-making, problem-solving, self-control, they're still developing. That's that prefrontal lobe of our brain. And that's one of the last areas of our brain to fully develop. And that is why when a youth begins using alcohol during adolescence, it really can alter the development of the brain. That's also why we see a greater likelihood of addiction, because it's literally changing the function of our brain. Teens who drink are more likely to experience several different adverse consequences. Besides the fact that it changes the brain and can lead to those lifelong consequences, I think that's really important as parents, as educators, that we help teenagers to understand that these are lifelong consequences and that they can't always be reversed. And so abstaining from alcohol is really our best defense in helping kids develop those really healthy brain functions that they need as they get older. Memory problems, trouble in school. That can be issues with academic decline, losing interest in extracurricular activities, lack of motivation. Maybe they'll have an increased problems with the disciplinary system at school. Sometimes we'll see kids who are actually using that substance within the walls of the school building. It can result in an alcohol violation. So some really serious consequences with school. Abuse of other drugs, it's not uncommon for us to have a teenager or a youth who drinks and also begins to experiment or use other substances as well. Social problems. So fighting or lack of participation in activities, maybe changes in friend groups, losing friends that they once had and moving to a different group of peers who also might use alcohol where they might feel more accepted. Legal difficulties, right? So minor in possession, driving under the influence if they're of driving age, 16, 17 years of age. Higher risk of suicide. So alcohol is a depressant. If we have a young person who's already struggling with depression and mental health issues, it can really exacerbate some of those mental health symptoms that they maybe have. It can increase their risk of suicide, but also just their emotional control, right? When somebody is under the influence of alcohol, their emotions are going to be a little bit heightened. So if they're already feeling sad and down, that alcohol can cause them to feel even more sad and down. And then death from alcohol poisoning. This is something that we definitely see more of in our teenagers and like the young adults, our early college age students, right? The 18, 19, 20 years of age. And that occurs when there's so much alcohol in the bloodstream that areas of the brain that control basic life function begins to shut down. I mean, we've seen this on the news. We've seen lots of different examples of this happening because of the rate at which that alcohol is getting into that young person's bloodstream, and they don't have the tolerance, their body's not used to processing that level of alcohol. In terms of warning signs of underage drinking, as with any other substances, a lot of times they'll overlap, whether they're abusing alcohol or they're abusing any other type of substance. And again, it's hard with teenage behavior. Normal teenage behavior versus what is a behavior that I should be concerned about can be really challenging for parents. I'm a parent myself. I am immersed in this right now with teenagers at my own house and understanding, well, are they in their room because they had a really bad day or they didn't do very good on a test, or are they in their room because they're going through something that really needs my attention? And so what I would say with these warning signs is collectively look at what's going on in the life of your child. And they may have just one of these, but really look and think, am I seeing this collectively? Is it happening more days than not? And is it a pattern of behavior? Those can really help parents to understand what might be going on. Obviously, if you find alcohol among a young person's things, that's a pretty big red flag, right? That tells you, yes, this is a problem. This is something I have to address. Smelling of alcohol on a young person's breath. Alcohol is different than some of the other substances that we see, that there is an odor, right? And so you might smell the alcohol. Slurred speech. If that young person is intoxicated. Coordination problems, looking stumbly or falling over or having trouble standing up. Problems concentrating. So that might be something that we see at school or in just other everyday tasks that they're doing, having a hard time paying attention and focusing, particularly if a student has been abusing alcohol for a period of time. You may find that they have a consistent problem focusing or maintaining their attention. Rebelliousness, again, it's normal for teens to rebel at some point. I would be surprised if I have ever met a teenager that didn't want to rebel at some point. That is the nature of adolescence. But if you're seeing a pattern in behavior or you just had this gut feeling that this isn't right, breaking curfew over and over again, not following rules, taking the family car without asking, different things that might start to add up to make you question as a parent, okay, what else might be going on in this picture? Changing groups of friends. We do see this more often with any type of substance use amongst teenagers. Now, they may have already been associated with a group of peers who started using, but it's not uncommon for us to see a teenager who maybe is kind of feeling like they don't know where they fit in. And they gravitate to maybe a group of peers that might be making riskier choices or decisions and start to use substances with that particular group. And so if you see that and you see that, well, they used to hang out with this group of peers and now they're hanging out with this group of kids and I don't know them, I don't know their parents, they've never brought these kids to the house, those might be questions that signal to a parent or an educator or to somebody who's invested in the life of youth to start asking some questions. Academic and our behavior problems in school. We kind of touched on the school problems already and academic problems, but behavior problems, defiance of rules at school, not following directions, skipping class, not coming to class. Are they missing class during certain periods of the day? For example, not coming back after lunch. And then when they do come back to the classroom, they appear different, or you might see different behavior changes because maybe they were using over the lunch hour. Less interest in normal activities or activities they typically once enjoyed, right? So if you have a student who was involved in the music program at their school and they no longer want to participate, but that haven't given you really indication as to why, they just don't want to participate anymore, that could be a red flag. And then being in possession of a fake ID. Okay, that's kind of goes back to finding alcohol among a young person's things or smelling alcohol. So there's some signs or warning signs that are pretty explicit, and there's others that we may have to dig a little deeper to understand what might be going on. As with any of these warning signs, err on caution. And if you just feel that you're concerned that your child is engaging in some of these behaviors, reach out and ask for help. Talk to your school, reach out and get information from community resources. You can talk to your family physician. They would be a great resource in terms of helping to identify if there is a substance use concern going on or if that student is engaging in underage drinking. Prevention is such an important and vital role when it comes to underage drinking. It's a vital role when it comes to any type of substance use, but we know that parents play a huge role in this. All of us play a role. Communities plays a role. Schools play a role. But parents really play a huge role in preventing underage drinking. And this statistic highlights that for us right here. 80% of teens say their parents are the biggest influence in their decision not to drink. 80% of kids. So that tells us as parents, wow, that's an awesome responsibility for us to make sure we're giving our kids the tools and resources they need to make healthy choices when it comes to underage drinking. Really recognizing the role of social norms. So when you look at the culture of drinking and you just think of the culture of alcohol use, even in our own communities, think of Husker football games, think of celebrations, that this idea that alcohol has to be part of our celebrations. And all of these types of social norms do influence kids in some way, shape, or form. And so it's up to us as parents that we talk about, what does that look like? How do you make sense of some of those social norms that you see when it comes to alcohol use? Part of that too is, for most people, it's accepted for adults who are over the age of 21 to drink moderately. They don't think that, that's not something that raises a concern. And so for kids, that can transcend into, well, if adults can drink moderately and be okay, I must be able to drink moderately and be okay. And again, apples to oranges when it comes to an adult responsibly drinking alcohol and a youth engaging in underage drinking. So really engage in conversations at all levels. There's some great resources that I'm going to get into here in just a moment, but will help guide parents at how do I talk to my kindergarten, first, and second grader versus how do I talk to my middle school student versus how do I talk to my high school student, and then how do I have conversations with my student when they go off to college and they're really immersed in some of these pressures to engage in underage drinking. Talking early, talking often, having conversations that are ongoing. Research tells us that it's not a one-time wham, bam, we have this conversation. Our kids know the risks associated with underage drinking. We want to have ongoing conversations and rely on those teachable moments where we can have natural conversations. That doesn't mean we have to put our kid right down in front of us on a couch and have a formal conversation about the risks of underage drinking, but if we're sitting down and we're watching a movie and there's adolescents drinking at a party on a TV show or in a movie, pause that movie, have a conversation. What do you think of this? These kids are clearly not 21. Do you have friends that engage in underage drinking that aren't 21? And how do you feel about that? Do you have questions for me about the risks associated with that? I like the few minutes that you can have in a car when you're driving with your teenagers or you're waiting at a stoplight or picking your child up from an activity and you have a few extra minutes. Those are great opportunities to engage in those conversations. A lot of parents aren't sure where to start. And that's no fault of a parent because these are hard conversations to have. You think about having these conversations with a first, second, third grade, and you think, wow, do I really need to have that conversation with my young child? Again, they look differently at each age, and there's some great tools and resources that I will share with you on how to guide you in those conversations. A couple of them that I really like are this MAD, The Power of Parents. They have got individual handbooks that parents can print. We also have these available through our SCIP office. A lot of our schools have this resource available. But they offer parents actually a checklist and guided conversations to help engage in those conversations surrounding alcohol use that can help parents think, okay, these are some key points I want to make sure I touch on, and then adding in their own pieces as well. That's not to say you have to print these booklets and sit down and read them verbatim to your child, but they are intended to serve as a guiding place for parents who might get caught up in the language and not sure what language to use or how to have that conversation. But these are some really great resources. TalkHeartToHeart.org has a variety of great resources for parents, for educators, for community members to help engage in conversations. There's some great articles and videos and talking points divided between various different topics, but you can click right on alcohol and drugs and it'll take you to a great number of resources that you can tap into as well. I really like the SAMHSA I Talk, They Hear campaign. Lots of great handouts and guided conversations, again, that will help parents kickstart that conversation. And those are often broken down into different age levels as well. I think as a parent, that's really helpful for me. When my kids were younger, I probably didn't have the right words to have those conversations. I knew I wanted to get the message across that, underage drinking is not healthy, but I didn't know quite how to have those conversations and have them in words where they would understand, that didn't go above their level of reasoning or thinking. An important piece to our prevention conversation is helping kids realize that even at the age of 21, when it is a legal drinking age, there are consequences to drinking, and that it comes with an immense amount of responsibility. So helping to provide that education that before the age of 21, it is illegal for you to drink alcohol. And we want you to follow the laws, and we want you to be safe, and to help guide them to understand the difference between underage drinking and responsible drinking once you become 21 should be part of that conversation. To share with us more information on how to engage in important conversations surrounding youth drinking with our adolescents, Terry Eafley, Region 5 Prevention Specialist, is going to provide us some more information on family standards and having those meaningful conversations.
I'm Terry Eafley with Region 5 Systems. I'm a prevention specialist, and I work with the Lancaster County Prevention Coalition. So I'm going to visit with you today a little bit about family standards, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like to live into our values as parents, and what does it look like to do prevention day to day with our kids. And that doesn't always look like having long, fraught conversations. There may be some of those, we hope not, but there may be some of those that take place. But more often, what it will look like is just day-to-day talks, and they will have less to do with consequences and threats, and a lot more to do with this is how we live as a family. And so it really is important that we think about that long before we have those conversations. And so there's a lot to the idea that we really start thinking about that even before we have kids. But even when they're very, very small, having those conversations on deck and really sort of thinking through, how do I feel about that? If I'm parenting in conjunction with someone else, how do they feel about that? And is there some agreement between the two of us, and maybe working that out before the moment where it's necessary that we have that conversation with our young person, so it doesn't devolve into something we didn't intend. All of those things are important, but wherever you are is a fine place to start. But pre-thinking some of that through is always a valuable thing to spend some time doing. We call this our family's good stuff because it is good stuff. And wherever you are is where you are, and it's a fine place to start. And all of that is of value. And I want to really hit hard the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect family. So that's not what this is about. And I think we put a tremendous amount of pressure on ourselves to nail it and to have it be Instagram worthy or, something that's Pinterest worthy. And that's not what this is about. I'm a parent. Our boys are both going to turn 21 in the next 3 months. And we came in sideways way more often than we landed it perfectly. And I'm super proud of both of them, and they are fantastic human beings, and it's fine to not stick the landing, and it's still our family's good stuff. So I want to make sure that we understand that that's not what this is about, so that we're very clear as we talk about what it means to live into our values, that that's not necessarily about getting it right. I think if we focus too much on being perfect, then we don't start. And the key is that we start because it's okay to adjust, and it's really even okay to go back and say, I've rethought this. And in some respects, I think that makes our message even more powerful because then it makes us even more human. And I don't know anything more powerful than an apology that's offered with sincerity. And that's also a good thing to model. So when we talk about living into our values, it's more than just about communicating, hey, we don't drink before the age of 21, although that's our end goal with this particular conversation. But there's a lot of other things that will get planted and nurtured along the way with this. And so as we start, I also want to say that it's our gift, really, to figure out what it means to figure out what we look like when we are our ideal selves as a family. And that we don't have that figured out when we bring that carrier home and set it down for the first time. It's been a long time for me, but I remember being very overwhelmed at that moment when we sat that carrier down and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't know. It turns out I don't know anything. And we figured all of that out along the way and worked through many, many things, in those first 6 months and those first 3 years. And then as he, grew and started school, we had to figure out lots of other things and interpersonal things. And he had lots of ideas and things that he did and didn't want to be a part of. And so it's a gift really for families to kind of figure out what do we look like as a family. And with each member that we add, if we add lots of members, what does that look like? And how does that change our dynamic? And how do we change and how does our ideal family look, as we grow as a family and as everybody ages. So enjoy the journey and don't let anxiety or nerves or worry derail you because it's unfortunate if we do that and then we miss out on something that really is a neat part of being part of a family. So enjoy that piece and just know that that's a gift, even though sometimes it will feel maybe tense or we'll walk away and think, that didn't go the way that I wanted it to. All of that's okay and normal, perfectly normal. So don't stress about those kinds of things as they happen because it's normal. Lots of things play into what our values look like. Maybe I come from a background where there is lots of trauma. And if that's the case, then I'll pull a lot of that with me into my parenting journey. And that means that I'll have to work through a lot of stuff before I can even present what I want to present as a parent. Or maybe I've decided I want to do some things the same and some things different. I remember having a list of things that I would never say or do as a parent and things that I thought I'll never say that. It really annoyed me when I was, a teenager, or most of it was when I was a teenager. And I thought I'll never say or do any of these things. And I think I said or did them all multiple times by the time he was 6. So what we repeat what we experience, and it's powerful and difficult to not do that. So we pull all of that forward with us. So that plays into our journey as a parent as well, and most of the time that serves us well, but sometimes we want to think about doing things a little bit differently, or how would we do that differently? And so that requires pre-thinking as well, and not waiting until it becomes a crisis, because if I wait for the crisis, I will just repeat. I will rinse and repeat what was most familiar, which is usually what I experienced. Not always, but usually. So what am I bringing with me? If I'm parenting with someone, what are they bringing with them? Who else is speaking into into our parenting journey do we have family around? And what are they speaking into that? Are there other siblings? Who else is around? Because it doesn't, family doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in community. And so that's a wide-ranging amount of influence, that will happen. And particularly as our kids start school, no matter where they're in school, if that's public, private, homeschool, they'll always have other influences. If they've got the internet, if they have a cell phone, if they watch TV, then there's all kinds of influences playing in, and we can't be with them 24/7, so we don't know what all they're taking in. So they'll have ideas that we don't even know are becoming a part of their value system. So we have there's a lot of responsibility there to make sure that our voice is one that they are constantly hearing in a way that is, affirming to them, and also a way that they hear and think, yep, that's something that I want to internalize, and that's a value that I want, that's a value that I value and that I want to take on, as well as other things that I'm hearing and taking in. And even if they don't articulate that or say that back to us, it's surprising and shocking, really, how often we'll find that they've internalized something, even if they don't say that, or if they actively push back. The example I'll give you is if you've ever taught a young person to say please and thank you. You know that happens through endless amounts of repetition. What do you say? Please. You give them something. What do you say? Thank you. And you think, gosh, we've done this and done this and done this, and they're still not doing it. And then you take them someplace else, and what's the feedback you often hear from that person? Your kid is so polite. And you think, well, not to me. Where is this politeness coming from? Well, it's because you've done all that work. And so they've internalized that value. That's how that happens. And that happens with an endless number of things that we do. And this is no different. It is the same skill set that we're using, but just with something that carries some far-reaching consequences or far-reaching effects that they'll carry with them forever. I suppose politeness is something they carry with them forever as well. So it is almost exactly the same. So let's talk about our family standards or values, and those I'll maybe use those interchangeably. They're the same. When I talk about those for the rest of this time, I'm using those interchangeably. What they are not is the same as a rule. And so sometimes that's confusing, and we think, well, I can give a list of rules, and I know earlier Abby had talked about, consequences and making sure they understand, and rules are very important. We have to have them. It's necessary and absolutely critical that rules are very clear, and that young people understand what they are, and that there are consequences if kids break them. But standards and values are wider than that. They encompass the rules. The rules should fall within that, but they're much, much wider than the rules. And a value or a standard that a family adopts, everybody lives under. So an 8 o'clock or a 10 o'clock bedtime might be what is the rule for the young people in our family, but I may not live under that. I get to choose my own bedtime because I am an adult. And the older I get, the earlier my bedtime is, but that is beside the point. I still get to choose my bedtime. So a rule doesn't necessarily have to be followed by everyone. A standard, everybody lives under. So it's a different and wider concept than just a rule. It's easy, I think, for people to think, well, I'll just state the rule, and if you break it or else. And that isn't what this is about. This is a much more subtle conversation and a much more winsome conversation that we should be having all the time, because remember, we want them to adopt this. I want you to follow it, but I also want you to adopt it, because after you're out of the house, this is something I'd still love for you to follow, because for lots of reasons, but mostly because it's going to keep you safe, and it's going to help with, for you to have positive outcomes as you grow into an adult. So what happens is people develop standards and values no matter what. Like, it will happen. It isn't something that we get to opt out of. And if I don't, as an adult, step into that and lean hard into helping those form, they will form regardless. And what happens is other things rush in to fill the void. So then it is media and peers and other voices that will begin to speak into the value. And then that happens all the time. And it probably happens in every family. They're just things that I don't articulate, or that aren't at the top of my awareness, and so I don't ever say anything. And then it catches me off guard when I find out, like, oh, you, young person who lives with me, feel very differently about this than I do. And so then it comes out and it's startling, and those are when arguments take place and tensions run high because, oh, we don't agree about this, and now I have to step in, and there's, there might be correction, or there might be multiple difficult interactions over this because I have to recalibrate. And, oh, actually, no, that's not how this is going to happen. And so the later we step into that, the harder the interaction will be. So the earlier we start, always better. Earlier is always better, because then it's just something we grow into instead of something we have to put on and train someone into. So it's always easier if we grow into it than have to put it on and get used to it. There's a couple of ways that we internalize. One is lived experience. So how did I grow up, and what did I experience and grow up with, and what did I see when I was growing up, and then what was my my early experience as a young adult, what was consciously or unconsciously modeled for me. So where we get into trouble with this is where maybe you've experienced this, where someone told you something and then did the opposite, which is everybody's favorite, young people included. Do as I say and not as I do. That is a guaranteed argument waiting to happen. But what's modeled for us is powerful, and we will tend to repeat what's modeled for us, because it is such a powerful tool in terms of behavior and also values, adopting what our values are and adopting what behaviors are acceptable. And then the last one is what is intentionally said. And so the most powerful is when all three of those things align. What did I experience? What was consciously modeled? And then what was intentionally said to me? That's like the trifecta of things when they come together. Like, that's powerful. And if you think of instances where that happened to you, they probably would stand out, and you'd think, yep, I knew that was important. Growing up, it was very clear. I knew very clearly that whatever adult was saying, whatever they were saying to me, they really meant it, because these were the three things that I saw. Whether you consciously saw that or not, you knew that was what was important. So I'll give you an example of what that would maybe look like. And so it's our family example about alcohol with our very soon to be 21-year-old son. So prior to him even, my husband and I had really different experiences growing up with alcohol. There was alcohol for both of us growing up, but we had wildly different experiences and wildly different opinions about how we should handle alcohol in our own home. And we didn't really have a whole bunch of conversations until our son was about 5. And then there was an incident involving, our son and a disagreement we had as adults about, what he should do surrounding alcohol. It wasn't a use thing. It was a go fetch a beer thing. And so my husband stepped in with our 5-year-old and said, okay, here's the deal. With alcohol, you will never see me drunk. You'll never see me drink and drive, and you'll never see me give alcohol to anybody who's not 21. For you, I don't want you to touch alcohol because there's no reason, and you're not to drink until you're 21. And so what's important about that is my husband, who was an adult, had 3 things he was responsible for, and my son had 2. He was 5. That's about all he could handle. And so everybody was going to live under the standard. Like, everybody had a job in the house, and that was just how that was going to work. So as our son grew, the standard had to grow with him. He went to Europe as a freshman in high school. So in Europe, the laws are different, and so he signed off, and he could drink. He could have wine wine in France and beer in Germany. So we signed off and said, yeah, if you choose to, you can try both of those things. And he was scandalized. And so we had to have a conversation about the law and how the law was different. And it was a fun conversation. And I thought, I can't believe we're trying to talk you into this. And this is so different from the law here in the United States. And he went and he tried it and he was like, yuck, I didn't like either one of those things. And I said, well, it's fine, but you still can't drink here. You're only 15 and you can't drink until you're 21. And I'd prefer you didn't touch it because there's really no reason. And then he went to culinary school. As a high school student, and he had to cook with wine. So he came home and he said, well, now I have to touch it. And you could just tell he was like kind of giggling and this is sort of funny. And I said, okay, well, I'll sign off that now you can touch it, but you still can't drink until you're 21. And he said, yes, I know, Mom. And so he was cooking with wine, a little Dixie cup of wine, and that was fine. And we were fine with all of that. And so he graduated, he was 19, and then he was dating a girl who was 22. And we were like, gosh, we know you're hanging out with some people who are a lot older than you. You realize that you still can't, even though everybody else around you is able to drink, you still can't drink until you're 21. And he goes, yeah, I know. And it was never a fight because remember, this was something that he'd been hearing all along. And, since he was 5 years old. And so now he is 20 and he'll be 21 in July. And so now the conversation is, when you turn 21, here's the deal. We don't want you to drink and drive. We don't want you to procure for people who are under 21 because that's serious. And we really want you to think really hard about how much you drink. Like you need to be very conscious about what you're putting in your body and what that looks like because there are consequences if you're going to drink alcohol, for how much you're drinking. We have a family history, those things are things you need to think about. So even though he's turning 21, the standard hasn't gone away. It's just grown. So he'll be 21. His standard is the same as the rest of the adults in the house. So the standard isn't gone. The standard has just grown to encompass everybody in the house. And so he'll grow and live under the same standard as everybody else. And that will just be how we live our life. And he said, yeah, I know. I'm comfortable with all of that. And we're comfortable with all of that because it's a conversation that's been ongoing. Not that it was never tense, because it was tense plenty, but it was never a fight because it was a conversation that started early. Here are some resources if you would like to learn more. This list contains some great ones. There is the SAMHSA Treatment Locator. If you are concerned about somebody who needs help, you can access the treatment locator there. The School of Community Intervention and Prevention website, SCIP's website, contains videos and downloads and access to other websites. Make sure to check them out. There are tons of resources for parents, for educators, anybody who is concerned about young people will find lots and lots of resources there. And all of these resources are available on our website, Talk Heart to Heart. That's www.talkheart2heart.org.